Door already. Well, good morning. Welcome to New Life. Thank you so much for choosing to spend part of your Sunday morning with us. I know we say this all the time, but some of you have not heard it before, or it's been a long time since you heard it. We're just incredibly grateful that you would choose to spend part of your Sunday morning here with us. We don't ever take that for granted. There are other places you could be. You could be, sleeping off your Thanksgiving turkey this morning. You chose to be here with us. We just don't ever take that for granted. So thank you so much for trusting us with an hour or so of your Sunday morning. As Denise said in the welcome, if you missed it, we are kicking off a 3-year-long series of messages, which is a long series of messages. You'll be forgiven if you don't, get all of the, next 3 years in, right? Like no one's going to be here for all 3 years every single Sunday. I might be, but actually probably not. But essentially for the next 3 years, we're calling this a series of messages, the Jesus Project. And I told you a couple months ago, I sort of laid out a hope and a dream for what we would do together in the next 3 years, which is simply that we would take some time to actually think deeply about who Jesus is, what Jesus said and what Jesus did, and that we would train ourselves to orient our lives as best as we could around Jesus first, Jesus only, and let everything else sort of fade into the background and make it so that the most important, most significant thing in our lives is how do I, in this moment in my life, how do I best follow Jesus? Because for me, and maybe for you, that is the most difficult thing that I do every single day. I don't know if I'm supposed to admit that or not, but I'm just admit it from the start. The most difficult thing for me to do every single day is to actually follow Jesus instead of following what I want to do and what the dominant kind of thread of my culture and the world around me wants me to do, what my neighbors, what my friends, spouses, kids, all that sort of stuff, what everyone else wants for me to do, sometimes does not look exactly like what Jesus wants me to do. And so the most difficult thing, the most trying thing, the most taxing thing that we can do is actually to attempt as best as we can to follow Jesus. And so what we're going to do for the next 3 years together, I know I keep saying that and I stumble over it every time I say it because I'm used to like the next 3 weeks or the next couple of months, but the next 3 years together is we're going to follow the words of the gospel writers about everything that they said about what Jesus did and what Jesus said and the implications of what Jesus was saying, what Jesus was doing for us as we sit here in 2022 on the verge of a new year, 2023. And kind of as we sit here today, wrestling with our best attempt to follow Jesus. Because here's what I know about you, because I know this about me. We all have some expectations about Jesus. If we've been in church for very long, we have created a certain set of expectations around who Jesus is, what Jesus said, what Jesus did. And a lot of those expectations were shaped by what we talk about on Sunday morning. And so what I've confessed a couple of months ago, and I'll confess again today, is every pastor at every church that you have ever been to has favorite passages in the Gospels that they go to. I include myself happily in that category. There's some stuff I love to preach about. Some of those passages where Jesus is teaching certain things and I just get fired up by him. I love to teach those. And then there are other passages that they just don't ever go to. And most of the time what you find, and maybe you won't, you don't know this, but I know this about me, so I'll just confess this about me. The ones that we don't go to are because we don't like them. I'll just let the pastoral secret out. So I'm confessing on behalf of my brethren, right? The other pastors. The reason that we don't preach about those is because we don't like them quite so much. And most of us, what happens is over time, if we try to follow Jesus, whether you just start beginning that journey or you've been following Jesus for a very long time, we tend to be drawn to the things about Jesus that confirm the things that we like about ourselves and the things that we want to hear and the things that we feel like we need to hear in a certain moment usually are the things that make us feel a little bit better about ourselves and maybe a little bit better about the way that our life is going. And we tend to avoid, and this is just a generalization, but I'll just confess it on my behalf and you guys can see if you find yourselves in there. We tend to avoid finding those things that challenge us. We tend to avoid finding those things that push back against the things that we like and the things that we want and the things that sort of speak, this is the language that we use, that speak to me in this moment of my life. And so what we're going to do together is essentially allow Jesus to speak as best as we can for himself. Now, in order to do that, I have to kind of get myself out of the way as best as I can, which is what I will try to do when we come to this moment in the service together. Try to get myself out of the way, but I'm not ever going to get myself totally out of the way. I'm always in the way a little bit. I interpret things and I think about things from my particular point of view. But as best as we can, we're going to not skip anything. We're not going to avoid anything, and we're not going to spend too long on any of the things that we like. Instead, we're going to ask Jesus to speak to us as he is, as we have the stories of him in the Gospels, because what we have are these 4 different accounts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, 4 different stories about who Jesus was. And they have a lot of similarities. There's a lot of stuff that they cross over on. In fact, all the major important stuff in Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all agree on it. And then there are these other little pieces where Mark tells a certain story that Matthew and Luke don't have, and John has a lot of stories that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have in their gospel. And we're going to look at all of those stories together, and we are going to ask ourselves, how do we best understand who Jesus is, and how do we best follow him? And so from the beginning, here's the thing that we have to say to start off this series, is that Jesus will not conform to our expectations, ever. He just doesn't. And the thing that you will find, and the thing that I will find already as I've started into my prep for the series, is that Jesus is so stubborn about this. Because we come to Jesus, we come to the Gospels, and we say, this is what I want Jesus to look like. This is what I want Jesus to say. This is what I want Jesus to do. This is how I want Jesus to address this issue or this person or that person. And what we find is that sometimes Jesus gives grace and mercy to people that we're like, no, I wouldn't do that. And then we find sometimes Jesus is really hard on these people, and we're like, Jesus, why are you so hard on those people? They're just like me. Why would you be so hard on me? And as we kind of go through this project together, we're going to try to, as best as we can, unlearn our expectations of who Jesus is, what Jesus said, what Jesus did, some of those things that maybe I've kind of, taught us into, maybe somewhere along the line, some other pastor, preacher, priest, whoever it was that kind of leaned you into these assumptions and these expectations that we have about Jesus. And so we're going to allow him to speak for himself, to push back against our expectations, to refuse to conform to our image of Jesus. And instead, let's try as best as we can to see him as he is, to hear him as he is, to understand him as he intends for us to understand him. One of my favorite theological lines that I've ever read comes from a children's book. It comes from the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. How many of you ever read the Chronicles of Narnia? Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis is a brilliant theologian, but some of his best theology doesn't come in all of the nonfiction books. It comes in these little stories that he writes. And in the story, if you remember the story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there's these characters, and they talk about the lion Aslan. And the lion Aslan essentially is a Christ figure in the middle of C.S. Lewis's story. And there's this conversation where these children are going back and forth. They've just entered the world. They've started to hear about Aslan. They're talking to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, if you remember this, right? And they're talking about Aslan, and they're trying to figure out what they can expect of Aslan. And here's the line that gets me every time, and this is the Beaver speaking back to the kids. He said, "Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you." He's not safe, predictable, tame, conforming to all of our expectations. They're saying he's a lion. You don't really get him to, kind of fit into your pattern. He's not safe, but he is good. And he is the king. I tell you from the start, this is who Jesus is. He's not safe. And so for the next 3 years together, we're going to let Jesus make us feel unsafe at times. We're going to let Jesus tell us what he thinks about us, about the world, about himself. We're going to, as best as we can, try not to make him safe, tame, and predictable, but remember that in all of it, he is good. And in all of it, he is inviting us to come and to follow him. So I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is I'm just going to pray. Not that I don't usually pray, but I should clarify that. I don't usually pray at this moment in the message, but I am going to pray at this moment in the message. And essentially what I want to do is just kind of set the stage for us for the next few years. So would you pray with me? Jesus, we all have a tendency to sort of try to conform you to the image and the set of expectations that we have of you. And there is in us that desire when it comes to figuring out who you are and what you want from us, to be drawn to those things that just fit our little box for you. And so, Jesus, I pray at the beginning of this project that you would take yourself out of the box for us. And instead of allowing us to kind of put you in and make you fit our expectations, would you, in these next few years together, would you speak for yourself? Would you show us for yourself who you are? And over again, would you invite us to leave our expectations and our predictability and our desire to tame you off to the side? And would we follow where you lead us? It's in your name that we pray. Amen. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first three Gospels, all begin their account of Jesus' life with some version of the events that happened when Jesus was born or some announcement of Jesus' birth. Matthew starts off with a genealogy, which we'll get to. He kind of tells a story of this is where Jesus came from, and then he starts talking about Joseph having a dream and Mary. Luke tells the story about Zechariah, who is John the Baptist's father, and sort of backdoors into the story that way, and then he gets to the Jesus narrative. Mark tells the story just, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he just kind of dives right into Jesus as a fully grown adult, doesn't tell us any of the birth story. But John, when he tells his story, starts way back before any of that stuff. And in fact, John sort of sets the stage for his whole story of Jesus' life in this very philosophical, kind of contemplative way with a prologue, essentially, to the life of Jesus. And as he points us to the life of Jesus, he says, I just want to sort of set the stage for what we came to understand about the person that we met when we walked around with him. John is one of Jesus' 12 disciples, one of those original guys who followed around with Jesus wherever he went. And he says, I have a story to tell that's slightly different from the other guys. And so here's how my story begins. In the beginning. It's always a good place to start the story, isn't it? In the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And John deliberately, at the start of his narrative, the start of his story, takes us all the way back to before there was any time, before there was any space. He says, I want, if we're going to tell the story of Jesus, I don't want to just start with Jesus showing up on earth. I want us to start way back before the earth even existed, before anything was made that has been made. I want to start way back in the distant time and space before anything ever existed that you've seen or that I've seen. I just want to draw our attention all the way back. And in his opening line, he essentially, as a good Jewish guy, he points back to the beginning of the Jewish Bible, which begins with these same three words, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now John says, now there was this moment in which there is a new beginning for the world. And so we need to just kind of understand that this all began all the way back in the beginning. This is where it goes. Can't just start with Jesus's physical life, his earthly life. And in fact, the way that he says it was in the beginning was the Word. He doesn't even say in the beginning was Jesus, which is a little frustrating for us or a little confusing for us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And what John does is he draws from this Greek philosophy, this Greek kind of way of looking at the world, and he says they have a way of saying that the world is ordered together, and they call it the logos. There is an order to the universe. There is a logic to everything that exists in the world. And so he takes this Hebrew way of thinking, he says in the beginning, and then he marries it up with this Greek way of thinking. There is some logic and there is some order to the universe. And he says, now I'm going to speak to both of these worlds. I'm going to do this together because that's the world that I live in. I live in this world where there's some people who, when they look for the order and origin of the universe, they go back to the beginning. They kind of read through Genesis and they say, this is how it all began. And then there's these other people over here on this other hand who don't know anything about Genesis. They've never read it. They just feel like when they look at the world, they see some sort of logic, they see some sort of order. And John says, I'm going to take both of these worlds and I'm going to put them together, and we're going to take these two phrases and these two words and we're going to throw them down in the same passage to begin my story. In the beginning was the logical, consistent, orderly principle that the universe thrives on. Because when you look at the world and when they looked at the world, whether they understood it exactly the way that we do or not, which they didn't, but they still could see, hey, there is an order to the way that the world works. There's something consistent. There's something that seems to hold this whole world together. In the beginning, John says, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and then he says the Word was God. And this is a problem for both the Jewish people that he's writing to and for the Greek people that he's writing to. So John really wraps himself into a knot already from the beginning of his story. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Greeks would say, in the beginning was the Word, I'm good with that. And the Jews would say, in the beginning, yes, there was God. But then John says, I'm going to try to, kind of essentially blow your mind just a little bit here. And I'm going to take those two worlds and I'm going to put them together. In the beginning was the Word, was this logical principle that holds the whole universe together. And the Word was there with God, that God who spoke into nothingness and said, let there be light, let there be a world, let there be a universe. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Jews would say, well, that you can't do that. Don't do that. You can say in the beginning the Word was with God. Sure, that we'll go along with that. But to say in the beginning the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God, and that all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made, that's a step too far, John. You can't start the story that way with these two concepts, these two ideas, mash them together and ask all of us to go along with you on this ride. And the most frustrating thing for us as we begin our Jesus project is, guess what? Guess who's not in verses 1 through 3 of John, at least not named anyway. There's no Jesus there. Did I miss it? Just in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was with God in the beginning, and all things were made through him, and without him there wasn't anything made that was made. There was this person who is the origin and the order of everything in the universe. And John says not only was he there with God, but he was equal to God. Not only was he there with God, but he actually was God himself. And in him was life. And that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not or cannot overcome it. In him was life, and that life was the light of men like us. And again, John sort of takes this journey back into Genesis, and you remember that when God began in the beginning, began the whole story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the first thing that God did was he spoke. That's at least the way Genesis tells it. He spoke and said, let there be light. And into this vast expanse of nothingness, all of a sudden, there was something. There was life, and there was light. And John says, I just want you to understand what was happening is before we tell the story of Jesus, before we get to Mary and Joseph and the manger and the baby and the shepherds and the wise men and all that sort of stuff, and we'll get to all that. before we get to that, you need to understand that what we experienced was something that told us that in him, in the Word, who was with God in the beginning and who was God, in him there was life, and that life lit up the entire expanse of the universe, including lighting up the expanse of our lives as we encountered him. In him was life, and what he means is not just like biological life. He means in him was the life that is at the center of the universe, that it's not just like living things based on what we breathe and, kind of the way our cells reproduce and all that sort of stuff, but there's something about the world that's bigger and more than just the biology of our life, but that there is life inside the universe. And John says, in him, in the Word who was with God and who was God, there is this life that is the center of the universe, and that life, not just the biology of it. That life was the light of men, and that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And again, he's just kind of using these two kind of images, life and light, over and over again to say, this is what the Word was about. The Word creates this consistency, this order to the universe, creates this place where everything functions the way that it's supposed to, and that life, that principle that's at the center of the universe, that's the thing that gives light to the entire universe. And that is the Word. And that Word was with God. And that Word was God. And that life and that light creating life shines at the center of this world. And nothing in this world, nothing in this time, nothing in this space, nothing that's been created can outshine the light or can overcome the light with its darkness. And then he sort of starts to get back into our world. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. And he points to this guy that we'll read about a little bit later, this guy named John the Baptist, who as he enters into the story keeps telling people there's someone who's coming, and when this person shows up, he is the life. He is the light of the world. You need to listen to him. And because of the way that John, had this weird but charismatic personality, people are drawn to him, and everywhere they go, they think, John, you're the guy that we're supposed to follow. You're the life. You're the light of the world. You must be the one. And John keeps saying, I'm not here to be the light of the world. I'm just here to bear witness to the light. I'm just here to point in the direction of the person who is coming, who is life and who is the light of the world. And when you see him, you will come to understand that I'm just like a candle. And he's the entire light of the universe. And the true light, John says, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And he was in the world, still hasn't named Jesus, by the way, just for the record. Still could be anybody. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but born of God. And this is the moment when John sort of starts to pivot his story from in the distant past, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and in him was life, and that life was the light of men. And as he starts to focus his attention down and focus our attention really down on the story that he's about to tell, it says that life, who was the light of the world, John said he was coming into the world. And that when he came into the world, there would be those who would look at him and would see him and would still turn away from him. They'd still reject him. They'd still push back and say they didn't believe that he was the life and the light of the world. There would be those who would look at his life and say, yeah, that's great, but you're not anything special. You're not anything significant. You're not anything more important than just some desert preacher in the backwoods of Galilee. But John, as he tells his story, says the true light, that light which was lighting up the universe, that light which was the life at the center of this world, that light which was the Word, who was with God and who was God, was going to enter into our world, our time and our space. That there would be some who would receive, and there would be some who would believe, there would be some who would turn their hearts in his direction. And they would find that when they turned their hearts in his direction, he gave them this incredible privilege of calling themselves children of God. And there were others, he said, who just turned away, looked at him, said, no, thank you. I don't want to be part of that. And even though he was in the world and had made the world, everything that the world is revolved around him, he would be vulnerable enough that he would allow us to choose to accept, to reject, to believe, or to refuse. He would make himself vulnerable enough to us as the life and light of the world entering into this time, in this space. And then here's sort of the crux of what John wants to say and moves us to this place. He says, so the Word, who was with God, who was God, who made everything, in whom was life, and that life was the light of men. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And it's the first time John finally tells us who he's talking about. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. This is probably the most crucial moment in John's telling of Jesus' story. I mean, there's all sort of stuff that comes after this, and it's all significant, it's all important. But without this moment, none of the other stuff makes sense. And John says, this is what you have to understand. The Word who was with God, the Word who was God, the Word who was life and the light of men, that Word entered into our existence. And he took on flesh, and he took on blood, and he dwelt and lived among us. And when he dwelt and lived among us, we saw the glory of God. We saw that light. We saw that life. We saw that brightness. We saw everything that makes God who he is. We saw all of that wrapped up in a person. And it's really ridiculous for John to say this, because as a good Jewish guy, there's no one who believes that God made himself visible to the world. They all believe that God was there and that God was powerful, that God had created, that God had made everything. They understood that. They believed that. And then John says, and then that God who was always invisible to the world made himself visible to us. And when we looked at him, what we saw was the glory of God. From the beginning of time, we saw it wrapped up in Jesus. And what we saw was Jesus filled with grace and truth. And what we saw was that over and over again, those who encountered Jesus met grace and truth. And what we saw was that those who met Jesus met these two things that seem to always live on opposite ends of the world. It's either grace or it's truth. And you know some Christians, and you've probably met some of them, who are all about telling you the truth. They're good at that. There's not a whole lot of grace that goes along with it. And then sometimes we meet followers of Jesus who it's just grace, grace, grace. We don't need to tell anything about the truth. It's just, kind of just grace, grace, grace. Jesus brings both of those things together. It says, here is the order of the universe. It orders around grace and truth. It orders around this life that is the light of the world. And from his fullness, John says, we have all received grace upon grace for ourselves. And interestingly enough, John uses grace 4 times in this passage, in this just couple verses. And you know what is interesting about his story? He never uses the word grace again in his entire gospel. Not once. 4 times here in just a couple of verses, and never again in his entire story. And yet, what you'll find as we read through John's story over time is that every person who encounters Jesus encounters grace over and over again. That what they received from him was grace in response to their need. And what they found was that every time they thought that maybe they had exhausted the supply of God's grace to them, Jesus met them with more grace in response. And he never shies away from truth. He never shies away from this is the reality of the world in which we live. And yet, over and over again, when men and women were in need of grace, and they meet Jesus, especially in John's gospel, what you find is that in the word we find inexhaustible grace. And as we begin this Jesus project, here's where I think we have to start. We have to start here. We have to start in the place that in the word who was with God and who was God and who was the life and light of the world, who made his dwelling among us, who took up residence with us, who took on flesh and blood and lived a fully human life here in this space. That in him we find not just those first century people that Jesus met. In him we find inexhaustible grace for us. In 2022, on the verge of 2023. Because here's what we'll find. You won't see yourself in any of these stories that we read. You weren't there. But you will see yourself in all of these stories. And you won't find your name anywhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Well, unless you have one of those names that's in there. But it's mine's not in there. Keith didn't make it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But I think you'll find yourself seated in some of those rooms and encountering some of those people. And I think you might find some of your own tendencies in those stories. And I might find some of my own weaknesses and sins in those stories. And what we hope is that over and over again, we find that there is grace to replace the grace that we thought we had already used up. An inexhaustible supply of grace, which is enough for you, and it's enough for me. It's enough for your neighbor, your friend, your coworker, your spouse, your kids. Yes, even the coworker that's really annoying. There's enough grace for him. Because what we find when we read through these stories is that we need grace for us. The truth is, the hard truth is, the uncomfortable truth is, we are, all of us, in need of grace. And I say that whether you've been following Jesus for 60 years or you're sitting here this morning saying, hey, someone invited me to come along with them and I came, but, I'm just kind of, I don't know exactly where I stand with this whole thing. Wherever you are on that spectrum, we are all in need of inexhaustible grace. And what we will find as we encounter Jesus is that grace is extended to us. That grace is present even with us here. Because the Word was with God. And then John says the Word was also with us. And that brings us hope. That gives us the opportunity to experience grace in response to our need. That gives us an access to inexhaustible grace that is greater than all of your weakness, greater than all of your failures, greater than all of your reasons why you can't follow Jesus, or why I can't follow Jesus, or why I've tried and haven't been able to do it before, why all of those things that we sort of stack up about ourselves. The Word was with God. The Word was also with us. And as the Word was with us, we found God extends grace, mercy to us. And He invites us, as we'll see, in the next 3 years, to come and follow Him, to receive His grace, and as we receive it, to identify ourselves as children of God in relationship with Him. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing together. Jesus, I thank you that you existed before there was anything in this world. And as we kind of begin this time, I thank you that you can point our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our attention back to the beginning. And at the same time, you can remind us that you are present here with us, that just as you were with those first disciples who saw you and identified you as being full of grace and truth, you are here with us today. So Jesus, we pray, would you allow us to just be wrapped up in your grace and in your truth? Would you allow us to let you speak the truth to us, but to do it in a way that shows that there's always grace for us? Would you change us as men and women who are seeking to follow you, seeking to understand you better? Would you transform our lives, mold us and shape us? It's in your name that we pray. Amen.